Knowing about Purich's work in medical technology and his investigations of the healing work of Arrigo, and knowing from her conversation with him when they had met that he would be interested in the case, Phyllis sent Andrea the photographs Bobby had taken of Reg's arm before and after his attempt to heal the burn. As it happened, Puharich had scheduled a trip to Miami early in March 1974, so he was able to meet Bobby personally and hear his story. It was routine procedure in Purich's investigations of psychics to put them into a hypnotic regression in order to see if any information could be gleaned from their subconscious as to the source of their paranormal abilities. He did this with Bobby in the presence of Phyllis, and although Bobby had never been under hypnosis before, he immediately went into a trance state and began to channel coherent intelligence of a kind that amazed them both. Though the conscious Bobby knew nothing of Purich's erstwhile cosmic colleagues, the entranced Bobby became a spokesman for an extraterrestrial that identified itself as Korean, which it later transpired was the name of a civilization and not an individual. "There will be a time we will be many on your earth," announced Korean. "We wish to be welcomed when we come. We wish to come. We bring no harm, we have come before. We feel the earth people cannot accept us, accept what is happening. We have chosen some as channels. Your people have to see to believe." Bobby, they learned, was one of the chosen channels. He had been led to Phyllis because, with her psychic diagnostic, she could guide his healings. But B was not strong, and in order to enable him to channel the energies required for healing, his physical body needed to be specially treated and equipped. That information particularly interested Phyllis, because in her psychic development class some days before, she and some other members of the class had witnessed a weird phenomenon. It looked as if wires were being inserted into Bobby's neck and throat. "Did we see it right, Korean?" Phyllis asked. "Was it an electronic circuit?" "In your terms, yes," the voice answered. "This is what it was. He is being, as you call it, wired." Andrea asked, "Can you estimate how much longer it will take to completely heal his physical body and prepare his conscious and unconscious mind to be your servant?" This brought a gentle rebuke from Korean. "He is not a servant. He is a channel we shall work through." Andrea apologized for misconstruing the relationship, but asked another question: "Can you in any way indicate what the purpose of your landing will be so that we can better understand and prepare man for that event?" Korean replied, "Man is confused. The earth is in great trouble. We come with love to help. It will be difficult for you to prove to your man of our existence. There will be many things occur prior to our coming and at our coming, as proof, so that we may be allowed to help. Bobby is one. There will be many who will not believe. You must help find a way to prove to them we come with love, and there have been many times we have tried and failed, for man does not believe, only what he can see. We will show many things." Andrea and Phyllis were instructed to proceed cautiously with Bobby, not to tell him all at once about the source of his powers and the nature of the task that was being performed through him. His conscious mind as well as his physical body needed to be prepared for undertaking the work. They would have to be discreet and patient, and Phyllis should speak to his wife in private, for he would need her help and strength. And for the present it would be unwise for Bobby to hear the tape of this communication. Slumped in a chair, his head lolling loosely to the right, Bobby uttered these instructions which, out of trance, he would have no knowledge of. After arranging with Korean to have another communication the following day, Andrea brought Bobby back to a normal state of consciousness, and asked him how he felt. Refreshed and relaxed, Bobby said, "But what had happened?" Andrea told him he had just proved himself a gifted channel as well as a healer. Both Phyllis and Andrea were concerned about the instruction not to tell Bobby the whole story at this stage, and they spent some time that night discussing the ethics of this. They came to the conclusion that they should go along with the request at least for a short time and see what happened. Andrea, Phyllis noticed, was both impressed and eager to continue. He said that it was as if Bobby was taking over where Ori had left off. In the last communications channeled by Ori from the space people, they had started giving information about their proposed landing. So they told Bobby that in trance he had functioned as a channel for an intelligence that they couldn't at present identify, but that could possibly be from another world. Bobby was excited and keen to continue working with them. And there were some questions he would like them to ask on his behalf. The first concerned his fear of death. He had had a conviction for so long that he couldn't remember how and when it started, that he would die on his 30th birthday, which would be on June 18th next. One night he had dreamed very specifically that B would die in a green car with a brown interior. He was so convinced that his fate was so predetermined that he would do crazy things, like walk blindly across a busy highway, convinced that nothing could kill him until the appointed day. His belief was only strengthened when his wife inherited a green car with a brown interior. When the three assembled the following evening, Andrea began, after putting Bobby in trance, by asking about this conviction and fear of his death. Korean answered that he would not die in a physical sense. He will be completed, be heated. We will have him completely ready for this work. That was good news. It was more a question of being reborn than of dying. I think we can explain that to him satisfactorily, said Andrea. But there was a second question. Bobby wanted to know why he had been chosen as a healer. Rather incoherently, Korean explained, we chose. Many years. This will. His life will change, a new life, a continue of life in his next age. He was chosen he was chosen before. He will soon understand and know. He was with you before. This was the first intimation of a fact that was to be repeated frequently in future communications, that the group that was convening for the present enterprise had worked together in previous incarnations. Could you tell us where and when? Andrea asked, stressing that it was not particularly important for him to have this information, but it might help Bobby to accept his role. We feel at this time, his consciousness would not accept the truth, Korean answered. He is not ready, his consciousness would only be more confused to know of when he was with you before. We need something to tell him, Phyllis protested, but she received only the assurance that he would know and accept everything soon. They were obviously going to get no further on that tack, so Andrea took from his pocket a list of questions he had prepared. First, was Korean aware of his own connection with Huva? Huva was the name of the extraterrestrial civilization that he and Geller had been given to understand they were in contact with. Korean answered, there are many who work with many on your planet. You have been contacted. You have done much already. We will advise you soon of what we ask you to do. Was Korean aware of who Uri Geller was? Andrea asked. Were they connected with the space people who used Geller as a channel? We know of this, was the answer. We do not work with him now. And to Andrea's further question whether they communicated with the group that worked with him, Korean replied, yes. We are many groups, and we are one. Returning to the subject of Bobby, Andrea asked if Korean had been responsible for the supposed poltergeist effects around him some months before. Yes. Just like the burn brought you here, these things brought Phyllis here. Pretty tricky you are. Andrea said with a laugh. You have been very clever in bringing Bobby, Phyllis and me together. Are there any other people we should move out towards, or be aware of, that you could identify or name? The arrangements will be made for you to meet another, Korean answered. You will be meeting number 3 soon. Andrea had a number of questions about the types of healing that Bobby would be capable of and the strategy they should pursue in publicizing his abilities. He mentioned the International Conference on Healing, the May Lectures, to be held in London in 2 months' time, and asked if it would be a good idea for Bobby to attend and demonstrate his healing powers. These are the ones who will aid you, yes, Korean said, referring to the doctors and other interested parties who would be attending the conference. But the most important thing was not to rush Bobby, not to demand too much of him too soon, to be content initially with convincing only a small nucleus of people of his abilities. Ultimately, if with care he could be made physically and mentally strong enough, he would be able to heal any condition. There is nothing that cannot be helped, there is nothing that cannot be corrected. But we will not again, now, do a work like the burn which was to draw you. We will start easy, we will start with lesser work to see how this can be accepted. If this is accepted, then things like you speak of will be accepted and done. It was going to be Phyllis's task to guide, control and pace Bobby's healing work, and to help his wife to understand him and to give him her support. You must try to explain to her that this work will not take away from her, but will add, Korean said. Phyllis promised to try, and after an exchange of cordialities and thanks, wonderful talking to you, said Phyllis, and a great privilege, said Andrea. Bobby was brought out of trance and the session ended. In view of the proposal that Bobby should go to London for the Conference on Health and Healing in May, Andrea wanted to arrange for the organizer and major sponsor of the conference, Sir John Whitmore, to meet him. John was going to be in New York at the beginning of April, together with his friend the English author and biologist Lyle Watson, who was also going to participate in the conference. So Andrea arranged for Phyllis and Bobby to be his guests at the same time. When John and some friends in England conceived the idea of giving London a taste of some of the positive developments on the counterculture scene, Andrea was the first person he thought of as a potential contributor. He had heard him lecture in California a couple of years before and had been impressed both by Andrea himself and by his talk, which had been about his work with Arrigo. He had approached Andrea and had found him not only willing to be a contributor but enthusiastic about the whole project and immensely helpful with suggestions and introductions to other potential participants. So when Andrea told him about Bobby Horn and the strange communication that had come through him and the proposal that he should participate in the conference, John was keen to hear more. The best way to put him in the picture, Andrea suggested when John arrived at Ossining with Lyle on April 7, would be for John to listen to the tapes of the 2 communications with Korean that they had had in Orlando 3 weeks before. When he had heard the tapes, John's mind raced with questions, doubts and suspicions. Who was fooling who? He wondered. Or was it a case of collective delusion? Or a practical joke played by discarnate beings, spirits of the dead who were mischievously sporting with the living to pass their time while they were waiting to reincarnate? This was perhaps a wild idea, but there had to be some explanation, and at least the existence of spirits was better substantiated than that of space beings. Bobby had to be the number one suspect, since he did most of the talking, or channeling as they called it. Suppose that he was only pretending to be in a trance state, or even that he really was in such a state, and it was his unconscious that was engaging in the dialogue. The story of the burn healing was suspicious, particularly as the main evidence for it was the photographs that Bobby himself had so conveniently taken before and after the event. But for Bobby to have invented and to masquerade as Korean, and to fool 2 people as experienced in psychic studies as Andrea and Phyllis, would have required knowledge, cunning and ingenuity surely quite beyond Bobby's capability. When they had met the previous day, Bobby had made John nervous, probably because he was so obviously nervous and out of place himself. He was tall, lithe and dark-skinned, he moved awkwardly and spoke hesitantly and softly with a southern drawl. Much of the conversation that had taken place in the house those 2 days seemed to go above his head, and though he was clearly excited at being involved with these people and a focus of their interest, he was worried about having left his wife and child behind in Daytona Beach. He just could be pulling a hoax, John thought, but he couldn't understand how, if that were so, Bobby could have spontaneously produced a scenario that so neatly tallied with Andrea's previous communications with extraterrestrials announcing a forthcoming landing and soliciting help in preparing mankind for it. He couldn't have read Andrea's book on Uri, for that was still in the press and not to be published until May. But if Bobby could be eliminated as either a deliberate or unwitting hoaxer, what about Andrea? The way the Korean communications dovetailed with the communications he and Geller had experienced, and the fact that Bobby had come into Andrea's life so soon after the split with Uri, just as Uri had come in soon after the death of Arrigo, were factors in the situation that had to be accounted for and naturally aroused suspicion. Did Andrea possess such great telepathic powers that he could project through a sequence of mediums? For before Uri there had been Dr. Finid, a complex and consistent scenario that served only to flatter his own ego. The facts certainly supported such a hypothesis. The trouble was that the facts were equally compatible with the hypothesis that the communications were from extraterrestrials who had chosen Andrea to be their ambassador. On that supposition, it would be logical that Andrea should have been led to one medium after another, and that after the misfiring of the Geller project the space people should adopt a representative endowed with paranormal powers more useful to mankind than an ability to bend metal. Phyllis, who seemed a sensible and capable woman, had testified that Bobby had already effected some quite remarkable healings, and that was a fact that didn't fit in with the Andrea as telepath theory. The alleged communications and the healings were separate phenomena and not necessarily connected, and for that matter there was no necessary connection between the communications received and the powers exhibited by Geller. But if there wasn't a necessary connection, there certainly was a meaningful one, what Jung would have called a synchronistic one. to maintain that the communications were a product of Andreja's unconscious and that Yuri's psychokinesis and Bobby's healings were phenomena unconnected with each other and with the communications, would surely be to practice a kind of philosophical caution and hair-splitting more likely to obscure the truth of the matter than to elucidate it. Such were the perplexities that John grappled with after hearing the tapes of the first two communications. They were mind-boggling and, he thought, quite insoluble in the present state of his knowledge. He would have to learn, see and bear much more before he could hope to make sense of the whole situation. There had been 3 more communications in the previous fortnight, and he now proceeded to listen to the recordings of these. The experience did nothing to alleviate his bewilderment, but on the contrary increased and complicated it, for these communications brought Phyllis into prominence and under suspicion. He had liked Phyllis immensely when they had first met the previous day. Though, with her blonde hairdo, heavy makeup, smart clothes and feminine small talk, she didn't fit his preconception of a spiritually developed person. She was warm and communicative and in this situation reassuringly normal. But the recordings he now listened to utterly confounded these first impressions of Phyllis. Andrea had left Orlando after the second session with Bobby, but before going he had given Bobby poshypnotic suggestions to enable Phyllis to put him into trance just as B had done. This she did the following day, March 19th. The ensuing communication was largely about some events that had occurred in Phyllis's class and about how she could help Bobby's work as a healer and gain his wife's support, but in the middle of the session there was a description by Phyllis of an operation being performed on Bobby, and though Phyllis's voice was level and matter-of-fact, what she said was too fantastic, too like hallucinatory raving, to be believed. John hadn't paid much attention to the talk in the previous communications about preparing Bobby's physical body for his healing work by equipping it with a kind of electronic circuitry, but now Korean announced that further adjustments were to be made in Bobby and the present was a good time to make them, and that if Phyllis wished to watch she could do so. Phyllis said she would and that she would describe what she saw happening so that Dr. Paharich could listen to the description later. "Yes, this is what we desire," said Korean. Phyllis's description followed. "As I'm watching and observing Bobby, his beat has been turned towards his right shoulder, about a 45. I'm sorry, 30 to 35-degree angle, and from his left temple to his neck area, to his collarbone, there is a glow, and behind his left car there appears to be a filling out in the neck area. His color is changing, his aura is changing. It seems to be giving an electrical surge of energy. There appears to be wires going into his hands, very fine gold wires, and they metallic bands of some sort, about a 1/4 inch, right, it's beginning to circle his head. There appears to be a swelling in the left side of his neck muscle, a little to the rear and below the ear, and there appears to be a rod of some sort, that's also glowing. And then there's a glowing light like a pencil, a pen light, which seems to be coming halfway up his left ear, about 2 inches to the rear in his hair. His watch is starting to magnetize, to glow on its own. I think perhaps in the future we should remove the watch. When I'm in his aura, in his vibration, and can pick up the physical condition, I can feel it in my own back, a group of wires, it seems to be, although I cannot observe this, I can feel it. Things seem to be going through the spinal cord, starting at the base of the spine. Bobby's head is now starting to turn around. Now there is a band glowing underneath his shirt, around his chest area. Now all that seems to be done, and he seems to be relaxed and in a deep sleep, and around his throat is a very bright reddish type of vibration or aura. The adjustments seem to have been made.